homesteading. Sometimes it feels like it's all just a little bit too much. But if you take the time to talk it out and really think about why you're doing what you're doing, you realize it's all worth it.
So the last few days have kind of been interesting, not so much in that there's actually been anything happen, but more we are kind of in between the spring sort of fury of planting and everything that goes along with that, and the real harvest. Harvests are starting, but it's really slow. So you have like a moment in the summer to think about things, and that's basically what we've been doing. Potentially thinking too much, maybe overthinking, but also coming back to some discussions on things that we have had periodically over the years, and just kind of hashing out some details on things.
The last few days have been a little rough around here, if we're going to be honest. I mean, there has been some big discussion, mostly I think on the livestock front, on whether we just have too much on our plates to really do it well, to really be able to enjoy life, and still kind of stick with our vision, I guess you could say, of being self-reliant and self-sustainable. Um, on the chopping block, I guess you could say, which comes up in discussion numerous times throughout the year, because you always have those low points, and we're not alone in that. We know that many homesteaders do come across those low points in the seasons. I think it is seasonally based, but when you have time to think about it, you start thinking about the things you'd like to do. You start analyzing that list that has grown and grown and grown exponentially over the year, and trying to come up with the best ways to really tackle it, whether it's better to just focus and zone in on a few things and do them well, and kind of just set everything else off to the side. And that's where we were earlier this week. And believe me, there was tears, there was frustration, there was sleepless nights, because realistically, we don't want to get rid of anything because we love what we do.
So in a lot of ways, it's kind of been a discussion of balance. And like Stephanie said, going back to our goals, or if you were doing this yourself, going back to your goals, I think the big ones are, we want to try, as we've talked about before, we're trying to grow as much of our own food as possible. We're trying to do that in a fairly sustainable, and use the term sustainable, but in a way that we can kind of keep doing that for a very long time. And we're still aware of the cost. For those who have kind of watched it, we've got some pretty extensive videos on cost breakdowns of yearly what it costs to do different things. And even though the animals were the big discussion point, some of it still has to do with the garden too. And a topic that has come up before, for those who have been following along with us, we have 38 acres. 38 acres is a lot of land, but different endeavors, for lack of a better way to put it, use that land differently. So we kind of, in a way, sort of, we're starting to feel like maybe we're at a bit of a crossroads between things that are really extensive and things that are a bit more intensive. And I think the best examples of those, and probably two of the big competing factors in our discussions, were on the animal front, rabbits and sheep. Rabbits are, relatively speaking, quite intensive. All the positives of them, being able to do them in a small space, having high turnover, fairly fast growth rate, all those things lead more to the intensive side, which, if that's the only thing you're focusing on, that's great. It's really manageable to do in a sustainable way. On the flip side, you have the sheep, which are better done more extensively, and they can go out, they can forage for their own food, they take a lot more land mass and a lot more resources than the rabbits do, but they also don't require as much time, etc. Now, where they really go head to head, for example, is infrastructure, because unfortunately we always have costs. So we sort of were spinning our wheels on a few things and a few discussions of what makes the most sense to keep meeting the goal of growing food, to do it in an affordable manner. And I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The fact that the cost of everything is going up is motivation to keep growing your food, but then you still have to look at, well, how much is it actually costing me to grow that or to get set up? And it's a serious consideration. And of course, 5 years ago, we may have looked at it differently than we do now. because granted, situations are just different. So it's finding that balance of those things. And although this is sort of sounding a little bit negative, I think going through the exercise, and I'm going to say it quite frankly, we had a few things, as Stephanie mentioned, that we had kind of put on the chopping block of, if we cut this out of the picture, then we can focus more effort, resources, etc. on other parts of the farm, or the homestead. But we kind of in the end sort of made the decision that we've already gone through this exercise last year, where I'm going to say it this way, we cut out some things that really definitely were demonstratable. There was no question the benefit didn't outweigh some of the negatives, and those things we no longer have. But when we got into the discussion again this year, one of the things we found was, and I think this is something you can always do with everything, you can always justify all the pros, but you really want to look at the cons. And we sort of found that the cons, when you took everything on its own, there really wasn't any cons. It was when you started putting it into a bigger picture whole that we got the impression that there was cons, but we sort of in the end decided the cons did not outweigh the benefits. Hence why, as we're sort of calmly doing chores at the end of the day, we're filming this video sort of talking about some of the thought process to go from where we were a week ago to today.
So basically, 5 days ago, we had made the big decision, a really tough decision for us to get rid of the rabbits. That was emotional. It was intense. We had the listing ready to go. We were getting rid of hutches, everything. It was dramatic, I will tell you. I mean, I should have filmed some of it because it was dramatic. And then we had like this moment of realization in that we chose the rabbits because that was something we could keep going for years. I mean, we could be 80 and still doing rabbits. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't know. Who knows what life's going to be like when we're 80? But it was kind of that coming down to it of, we have put so much thought into every animal, every plant, everything that we have on the farm. We don't make any decisions lightly, as you will know from following our channel. We usually talk ourselves out of things because we put so much research and planning into everything. And when we looked at that, we said we chose to have the rabbits for a reason. The rabbits are still with us 10 years later for a reason. And that was because even if they seem like they cost us more per pound right now than maybe the bigger livestock, or maybe they don't use the land as well, the big thing with them was we have a sustainable population already, and when we're 80, we could still cuddle bunnies. A negative to making the decision to keep, let's go back for 1 second. When we were making this decision about getting rid of the rabbits, one of the things that really is in the back of our mind is, when it comes to that list of getting things achieved on the farm to make it run smoother, there's infrastructure still needed, and infrastructure costs money. And this year, as we research the cost of that infrastructure, it's going up. And we need fences for sheep. That's a big investment. We need more hutches and bunny space. We need more infrastructure for them. So it kind of is that thing of trying to figure out the balance of where the money goes as well. It's not just about food. It's not just about our health. You have to consider your pocketbook as well, and you need to invest your money wisely. And that's part of where our discussion really came in on them, was just, do we spend more money on the rabbits, or do we focus on spending the money on the sheep? And in the end, we said what we already have with our Champagne d'Argents is valuable, and it's worth the investment. And I think that's the big thing to always come around to in your discussions and your decision making, is to not always look at the moment right now, but look towards the future and going, well, okay, maybe I need to put in $2,000 right now. And that does sound like a very big investment. But if that investment is going to keep you going for another 30 years, is it really that big of an investment?
Another thing that was actually kind of on the chopping block was the geese. And the reason was similar, but slightly different for the geese, because they don't take a lot of time. they're not particularly expensive. I hesitate to say in some ways that they are single purpose because there are multiple products that you can get out of them. But we do find, to a small degree, they do directly compete with the sheep because they are grazers. And they still require space. And so that still comes down to infrastructure. Basically, the reoccurring theme here is any animal you own will require space and infrastructure. And sometimes that could be your limiting factor on what you decide to keep and what you decide to part with or not start raising in the first place. So why weren't the chickens and the sheep on the chopping block? They were certainly discussed, but it really came down to multiple purpose. And I'm not going to say that the rabbits and the geese don't have multiple purposes. Really, that's part of why we made the end decision to keep them. But the chickens, the eggs alone are super valuable, and the fact that we produce so many chicks, even with the cost of feed and having to figure out alternative ways to feed and whatnot to help reduce costs, they're still a completely no-brainer. And the sheep were similar, even though the infrastructure is fairly intensive, i.e. you need a lot of fencing. You get triple products potentially. Now we've only managed so far to get 2 of those 3 products from them, but that still is worthwhile. Kind of wrapping this up in a way, we're not sharing this to try to sound like we're flaky, constantly changing our minds, etc. This has been a long process, really, since we moved here, and it was something we talked about, that when we moved properties, it really changed a lot of variables, and with each one of those variable changes, oh, this is sounding very analytical, each one of those variable changes that slightly altered has a chain reaction. And this conversation was sort of, in a way, may not be the end of the end, but it was really kind of the last discussion on that chain reaction in a way, because time's important. And as I stand in front of some of our garden here, the garden, although economically, is by far, without a doubt, the best return on your economic investment, is also your most intensive from a time perspective. So trying to find that balance, when we, like I say, going back to the beginning, when we break each one of the things apart, the sheep, we have the potential for meat, the fleece, and potentially milk, although we don't know that that can be a huge thing. We may still be dependent on some milk. The chickens, we get eggs, and we get a lot of meat, and we do it relatively economically, and the eggs alone really help float you on that sort of, if you eat animal matter on the protein side of things, and throughout the year, and have a lot of multiple uses. And there's not a lot of alternatives to chickens, although there are some. There's not a lot because you're getting eggs. The rabbits are very easy to look after. They do consume a lot, but they have a pretty quick turnaround, and essentially they're fantastic for small spaces, and they go really well with the garden. And the geese are very low input, very low expense, semi-low return on that, i.e. they're not as productive as, say, the chickens, but they make a really good sort of floater animal because of their low time investment and low sort of input costs. If some of your other things don't quite perform as well in a given year, they could be a really good floater to have. So from a prepping standpoint, it really doesn't make sense for us to get rid of any of it, because the other part that I think in today's day and age, and this will be the last point, but we're so used to everything being disposable and replaceable, but as we've seen in the last few years, it's getting, and not everybody agrees with this, but it's getting harder and harder to replace things. So if you make a decision to get rid of something, such as a herd of rabbits or flock of sheep or whatever it is, you're never really getting that back, even if you make the decision later that you're going to get rabbits again, because all of that time and effort that you've put into making it what it is, for however many years you've done it, is essentially lost, and that's a pretty stark, sad thought. But it's also an extra value point for all of it because, yeah, it's all got potential for food, and that all has value no matter what the future throws at you. So, on that note, nothing's changed, but we figured we'd share some of this thought with you, and nothing else. It's something to think about in your own homesteading endeavors.